I'm Edward, your host, and it's a pleasure to share this quiet moment with you. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and is there a wedding you'll never forget? Write it below and subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now, settle back and enjoy the story. Chapter 1. Dusk at Alderwick Church. The afternoon of the 28th of June in the year 1957 had been uncommonly warm for the lower downs, and by 4 o'clock, when the small congregation began to gather at Alderwick Church, the air hung heavy and still over the lane. Miss Marple, who had been staying with her old friend Dolly Bantry at the nearby manor for the better part of a week, had been included in the invitation to witness the marriage of Clara Hewson to Mr. Thomas Reed, and she walked slowly up the path beneath the yew trees with a sense of quiet anticipation that such occasions always brought. It was a modest wedding, as village weddings often were. The church, Norman in its origins and much restored in later centuries, stood at the eastern edge of Alderwick proper, surrounded by gravestones that leaned companionably against one another in the long grass. The interior was cool and dim, smelling faintly of stone and the lilies that had been arranged along the windowsills by women whose hands knew the work well. Perhaps 30 people had come, no more, and they settled into the pews with the comfortable murmur of those who had known one another all their lives. Miss Marple took her place beside Lady Bantry in a pew toward the back, where she might observe without intruding. Dolly, never one to resist commentary, leaned close and whispered, "Clara Hewson is a dear girl, so capable, looked after her father through his last years without a word of complaint. One always hoped she would find someone suitable." Miss Marple nodded, gently, her bright eyes taking in the scene. The bride had not yet arrived, but the groom stood at the front with an air of patient earnestness. Thomas Reed was a man of perhaps 35, tall and spare, with a serious face and the careful grooming of one who had recently returned from the city. He had been employed, Miss Marple understood, in some clerical capacity in London, and had only lately come back to the countryside to take up a position with a local firm. There was something reassuring in his steadiness. Yet Miss Marple found herself thinking, as she so often did, of a young man in St. Mary Mead, who had worn just such an expression before his wedding, and who had been entirely unaware that his bride was quietly terrified. The organ began softly, and the congregation rose. Clara Hewson appeared in the doorway on the arm of her uncle, Mr. Hugh March, a genial man with a broad face and the comfortable manner of one who preferred life to run smoothly and without unpleasantness. He smiled down at his niece with unmistakable affection. Clara herself was a slender woman of perhaps 30, neither beautiful nor plain, but possessing that quality of quiet composure that can be more memorable than mere prettiness. Her dress was simple, cream-coloured rather than white, and suited her well. Her dark hair was arranged beneath a veil of fine lace, and she carried a small bouquet of roses from the garden. As she walked up the aisle, Miss Marple observed her face with the gentle attention she brought to all such moments. Clara smiled certainly. She inclined her head to the guests and met their eyes with warmth, but there was something in the way her gaze moved past Mr. Reed, something in the brightness of her smile when it was directed at others rather than at the man waiting for her, that stirred a faint question in Miss Marple's mind. She had seen brides nervous, brides elated, brides solemn with the weight of the moment, but this was something else, something more like resolution. The service proceeded with the familiar words. The vicar, an elderly man whose voice carried the gentle authority of long practice, spoke of duty and comfort, of love and faithfulness. Mr. Reed gave his responses clearly. Clara's voice, when she spoke, was steady and low, but Miss Marple, who had excellent hearing despite her years, detected the slightest hesitation before the word obey. In the third pew sat Mrs. Eleanor March, Clara's aunt, the wife of Hugh. She was a woman of perhaps 50, handsome and upright, with keen eyes and capable hands folded tightly in her lap. Miss Marple had been introduced to her earlier in the week, and had found her intelligent and direct, though perhaps inclined to manage matters more than was always comfortable for those around her. Now Mrs. March watched her niece with an expression that was difficult to read, something between pride and anxiety, and once or twice she glanced toward her husband as though seeking reassurance he did not notice. The churchwarden, Mr. Peter Dawes, sat near the front in his official capacity. He was a precise man of middle years, keeper of the parish records and guardian of propriety, and he followed the service in his prayer book with the same attention he brought to all matters of order and correctness. When the vows had been spoken and the register signed in the vestry, the small party emerged into the late afternoon light. The sun, now lower in the sky, cast long shadows across the churchyard, and the warmth that had pressed down earlier had given way to something gentler. There was to be a simple gathering at the March home afterward, tea and cake and the modest celebration that suited both the means and the temperament of those involved. Photographs were to be taken first. The photographer, a young man from the next village, was arranging his equipment near the church door, and the guests milled about in the pleasant way of such moments, speaking in low voices and offering their congratulations. It was then that Clara turned to her new husband and said, quite calmly, that she wished to step outside for a moment before the photographs were made. "Only a minute," she said, and her voice was perfectly composed. "While the light is still kind, I should like a moment of air." Mr. Reed, agreeable and unsuspecting, nodded at once. "Of course, my dear. We shall wait for you." Mrs. March moved as though to accompany her, but Clara shook her head with a small smile. "I shall only be a moment, Aunt Eleanor, I promise." And so she went, walking alone past the yew trees and out toward the lane, her veil lifting slightly in the faint breeze. Miss Marple, standing beside Dolly and Haydock, who had arrived late and was apologising cheerfully for it, watched her go with that same faint stirring of unease she had felt during the service. "A lovely bride," said to Haydock, a bluff and kindly man who had attended half the village, through ailments great and small. "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Lovely." 5 minutes passed, then 10. The photographer grew restless, and Mr. Reed began to glance toward the lane with the first touch of concern. Mrs. March spoke quietly to her husband, and Mr. Dawes consulted his pocket-watch with a frown. By the time a quarter of an hour had gone, Mr. Reed walked down the path himself, calling Clara's name in a voice that tried to remain calm. He returned shaking his head, his face pale. Others joined the search, moving through the churchyard, along the lane, past the hedgerows and into the fields beyond. Voices called out, first hopefully, then with growing urgency. When dusk began to settle, deep and blue over the lower downs, Inspector Slack arrived from the market town, summoned by the vicar's telephone call. He was a man of firm opinions and limited imagination, and he listened to the account with a scepticism that did not quite conceal his concern. "A bride who walks away from her own wedding," he said, addressing the gathered party with the tone of one pronouncing judgment. "Well, it happens, doesn't it? Cold feet, second thoughts. Some do run off, you know." "Clara would never do such a thing," said Mrs. March sharply. "Never!" But her voice, Miss Marple noticed, carried a note not quite of conviction, but of something else. Something that might have been knowledge, or perhaps only fear. The search continued through the night, lanterns bobbing in the darkness like uncertain stars. By morning, Clara Hewson had not been found, and the village of Alderwick, which had gathered in hope only hours before, was left with whispers, worry, and the terrible uncertainty of a disappearance that had no shape and no sense. Miss Marple, returning to the manor house in Dolly's motor car as the first light touched the horizon, said very little, but her mind, as always, was occupied with questions that had no easy answers, and with the memory of a bride who had smiled at everyone except the man she was marrying. Chapter 2. The Veil on the Stone Wall. The discovery was made at first light by a boy named Robin Tate, who had been sent out to check the sheep in the upper meadow, and had taken, as boys will, the longer route that offered a better view of the countryside. He came running back to his father's farm with the breathless urgency of youth, and within the hour the news had reached Inspector Slack, who was conducting inquiries from the front room of the March household with the determined air of a man who believed all mysteries could be solved by sufficient questions asked in the right order. Miss Marple heard of it from Dolly, who had driven into the village at an hour earlier than was her custom, drawn by that mixture of concern and curiosity that attends any significant disruption to the ordinary pattern of life. "They've found her veil," Dolly said, settling herself into the morning room at the manor, with the air of one bringing intelligence of great moment. "On the stone wall, above the old marl cuttings, of all places. Folded as neat as you please," young Robin said. "The inspector has gone to see her himself." Miss Marple set down her teacup with care. "The marl cuttings," she said thoughtfully. "That is not a place one would choose for a pleasant walk, is it? Particularly not in wedding attire." "Indeed not," said Dolly. "Steep and crumbly and quite unfashionable for years. Nobody goes there except the occasional boy looking for adventure, or sheep that have wandered too far. It's all broken ground and loose stone, and the old workings are deep in places." "How very singular," murmured Miss Marple. She gazed out through the window at the garden, where the morning sun was just beginning to warm the roses, but her mind was occupied with the image of a bride walking away from her wedding and making her way to such an unlikely spot. "And the veil was folded, you say?" Robin was quite clear about it. "Folded exactly," he said, the way one might fold a handkerchief to put away in a drawer. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her saucer. Then she said, in her gentle way, "I wonder if Dr. Haydock has seen it yet. He has such a sensible eye for these matters." Within the hour, Miss Marple and Lady Bantry had made their way to the site, driven by Dolly's chauffeur in the comfortable motor car that made such expeditions possible. They found Inspector Slack already there, along with Dr. Haydock, Mr. Reed, and several others who had gathered with the sombre fascination that attends any scene of mystery or misfortune. The stone wall in question ran along the ridge above the old marl cuttings, a low barrier of weathered limestone that marked the boundary between pasture and the rough ground beyond. The cuttings themselves fell away steeply, scarred and irregular where men had once dug for the chalky clay used to improve the soil of surrounding farms. That industry had ceased long ago, and nature had softened the edges without quite concealing the work that had been done. The veil lay upon the wall in the morning sunlight, precisely folded into a square no larger than a book. The lace, which had been so fine and delicate the previous afternoon, showed no sign of tearing or distress. It might have been placed there by a careful hand preparing to leave for market. Inspector Slack stood with his hands clasped behind his back, regarding it with the expression of a man confronting evidence that did not fit comfortably into his preferred theories. "Well," he said, addressing the small assembly, "it seems clear enough what happened here. The poor woman came up in distress, folded her veil as a sort of farewell gesture, and threw herself over. We shall need to search the bottom thoroughly, though it's nasty ground for it." Dr. Haydock, a man who had seen enough of human frailty to be sceptical of easy conclusions, shook his head slowly. "I doubt it very much, Slack. A woman in despair, sufficient to take her own life, does not stop to fold her veil with such precision. And look at the ground here, man. No marks of struggle, no disturbance of any kind. If she had stumbled or fallen in haste, there would be signs of it." "Perhaps she was very calm," suggested Inspector Slack, though without great conviction. "Determined, you know." "Then why remove the veil at all?" said Dr. Haydock reasonably. "If one were determined on such a course, the veil would be the least of one's concerns." Miss Marple had moved closer to the wall, and now she stood looking down at the folded lace with the quiet attention she brought to all things that seemed to speak more clearly than words. After a moment she turned and looked out across the landscape. From this vantage the view was considerable. One could see the village of Alderwick nestled in the valley below, the church spire rising above the trees, and beyond that the rolling farmland of the lower downs stretching away towards the horizon. The afternoon sun, when it began its descent, would strike this wall directly, catching it in golden light while the valley below fell into shadow. The light would be very beautiful here at dusk, Miss Marple observed, more to herself than to the others. Quite the last place to catch the sun before darkness fell. Mr. Reed, who had been standing apart with the stricken look of a man whose world had been overturned, spoke for the first time. "Why would Clara come here? She had no reason. She knew this place was dangerous." Did she know it well? Asked Miss Marple gently. Mr. Reed hesitated. I suppose she must have done. She grew up in this village, but she never mentioned it particularly, and we certainly never walked here together. Young people do not always share every corner of their past, said Dr. Haydock kindly, particularly the places that held no romance or special meaning. But Miss Marple, watching Mr. Reed's face, thought that there was something in his uncertainty that spoke of a deeper ignorance. A man might marry a woman and know very little of the landscape of her heart, particularly if she were the sort who kept her own counsel and smiled more readily at others than at him. Inspector Slack had taken out his notebook and was making notes with the deliberate air of one establishing facts. The veil will need to be examined properly, and we shall organise a search of the area below. If Mrs. Reed, that is to say Miss Hewson, if she did come to harm here, we shall find evidence of it. I think you will not, said de Haydock quietly. This does not have the character of accident or violence. It has the character of something quite different. And what would that be? Demanded Inspector Slack, with the irritation of a man who disliked having his conclusions questioned. Dr. Haydock shrugged. That I cannot say, but I have seen enough of death in my years to know what it looks like, and this is not it, Miss Marple said. Nothing, but she bent down and examined the wall itself more closely. The stone was old and rough, but the surface where the veil had been placed was clean, brushed free of the lichen and small debris that accumulated on such surfaces. Someone had chosen this spot with care, had perhaps even cleared it before laying down the folded lace. Catches the sun, she said softly, straightening with the slight stiffness of age. At dusk, when the valley is already in shadow, this wall would still be in light. One could stand here and be seen from quite a distance, I should think. Or one could see something below, a signal, perhaps, while remaining quite visible oneself. Inspector Slack frowned. A signal? What sort of signal? I could not say, said Miss Marple mildly. I am only observing that it is possible. The visibility from here is very good in both directions. Lady Bantry, who had been examining the veil without touching it, spoke up. It is beautifully folded, I must say. The sort of fold one makes when putting away something precious. Not hurried, not careless. If Clara folded this herself, she took her time over it. Why would she do such a thing? Asked Mr. Reed, his voice hollow. If she meant to leave me, why not simply say so? Why this performance? No one answered him, for there was no answer that could be given with certainty. But Miss Marple, looking at the folded veil in the morning light, thought of other things that had been folded and put away, other moments when people had chosen to mark an ending with a gesture of care rather than haste. It spoke, she thought, of someone who had made a decision not in panic or despair, but with full knowledge of what they were doing and why. The search of the marl cuttings was organised for later that morning, though de Haydock's scepticism proved well-founded. No trace of Clara Hewson was found among the broken ground and scraggly vegetation. No torn fabric, no disturbed earth, no sign that anyone had fallen or been harmed there. By afternoon, when Miss Marple and Lady Bantry returned to the manor, the mystery had only deepened, and the village of Alderwick was left to wonder what manner of disappearance could be so deliberate, so careful, and yet so complete. Chapter 3. A Marriage Notice Amended. It was on the second morning after Clara's disappearance that Mr. Peter Dawes appeared at the manor house, arriving on foot despite the warmth of the day, and carrying under his arm a leather-bound volume that Miss Marple recognised at once as one of the parish registers. He was shown into the morning room where Miss Marple and Lady Bantry were taking their coffee, and he accepted the offer of refreshment with the stiff courtesy of a man who had come on official business, but had not entirely determined what that business required of him. "I hope you will forgive the intrusion," he began, settling himself on the edge of a chair, as though prepared to leave at any moment. "But there is a matter that has been troubling me, and I find that I should value a second opinion, or perhaps a third, before taking it to Inspector Slack." "We are entirely at your service," said Dolly warmly, "though I cannot imagine what Miss Marple and I could offer that. would be of use in official matters." Mr. Dawes smiled faintly. "You would be surprised, Lady Bantry, how often the official view of things overlooks the smaller details. It is precisely those details that concern me now." He opened the register with the careful hands of one who had spent years in the preservation of the records, turning the pages until he reached the entries for the current month. "Here," he said, turning the book so that the ladies might see. "The marriage notice for Clara Hewson and Thomas Reed." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, adjusting her spectacles. The entry was written in the clear, formal hand that such documents required, noting the names of the parties, their ages and occupations, and the date of the intended marriage. All seemed in order, except for one small detail that became apparent upon closer examination. The date had been corrected. Where the 28th of June was now written, there was clear evidence of an alteration. The ink user for the correction was fractionally darker than that of the surrounding text, and the numerals, though carefully formed, sat just slightly above the line of the original entry. "You see it, I am sure," said Mr. Dawes. "The date was changed." "When was the correction made?" asked Miss Marple. "That is precisely what troubles me," said Mr. Dawes. "It was made on the afternoon of the wedding itself, no more than 2 hours before the service. I discovered the error myself during my regular review of the week's entries. The original date had been recorded as the 27th, which was, of course, incorrect. I corrected it at once." "A clerical error, then," said Dolly reasonably. "These things do happen, surely." "Indeed they do," agreed Mr. Dawes, "but it is the timing that gives me pause. Why should such an error have gone unnoticed until the very day of the wedding? The notice had been posted for the required period, examined by the vicar, by myself, by Mrs. March, who stood as witness to the declaration, and yet none of us observed the mistake until that final afternoon." Miss Marple was silent for a moment, studying the page. Then she said in her mild way, "Was the original entry made in your hand, Mr. Dawes?" He hesitated. "No. That is another curious aspect of the matter. The original entry was made by the vicar's assistant, a young man who helps with the administrative duties. He's usually quite reliable, but he had noted the 27th rather than the 28th. When I pointed out the error, he was most apologetic and could not account for the mistake." "And who was present when you made the correction?" asked Miss Marple. Mr. Dawes frowned slightly, as though the memory required effort. "I was alone in the vestry when I first noticed it. I corrected it immediately, as is my duty, but afterward, when I mentioned the matter to Mrs. March, who had called at the church to confirm some detail about the flowers, she seemed, well, I would not say distressed, but concerned that the error had occurred at all." "What did she say?" prompted Dolly. "She said details matter, especially before vows. And then she asked to see the corrected entry herself, which struck me as unusual. She examined it quite closely, and then she thanked me for my diligence and left rather quickly." Miss Marple's gaze had returned to the register, and she was studying not merely the correction itself, but the page as a whole. "Mr. Dawes," she said at length, "in your experience, when a date is recorded incorrectly, is it usually a matter of transposition, or of simple misreading?" "Most often misreading," said Mr. Dawes. "Someone glances at a calendar or a note and records the wrong number. But in this case, the assistant insists he copied the information directly from the application form submitted by Mr. Reed himself." "And what did that form show?" asked Miss Marple. "The 27th, said Mr. Dawes quietly. "Which means either Miss Reed made the error when completing the form, or there was some confusion about the intended date from the very beginning." Lady Bantry looked from one to the other. "But surely Mr. Reed would know the date of his own wedding. Men may be vague about many things, but not that." "One would think so," agreed Mr. Dawes. "And yet when I spoke to him yesterday, he seemed genuinely puzzled by the whole business. He said he had always understood the wedding to be on the 28th, and could not imagine why he would have written the 27th on the form." Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a wood-pigeon called from the garden, its voice soft in the late morning air. When she spoke, it was with the thoughtful tone of one following a thread that led into shadows. "Dates," she said, "are curious things. We think of them as fixed and certain, but in truth they are often the source of great anxiety. A date recorded wrongly might be a simple mistake, or it might be something else entirely. It might be an attempt to obscure something or to draw attention away from it." "What could a single day's difference possibly obscure?" asked Dolly. "That would depend," said Miss Marple gently, "on what else depended upon that date. A wedding date is recorded in the parish register, of course, but it is also noted in other places. In family Bibles, perhaps, in letters, in memories, and if one date led back to another date, earlier and more significant, then the difference of even a single day might matter very much indeed." Mr. Dawes was watching her closely. "You are suggesting that the error was deliberate." "I am suggesting nothing," said Miss Marple. "I am merely observing that great care was taken to correct it, and that Mrs. March, who is Clara's aunt and has known her all her life, was particularly concerned that the correction be made properly. One wonders why such care should be necessary for so small a matter, unless it were not really small at all." She paused, then added, "May I ask, Mr. Dawes, whether the marriage notice itself, the one posted in the church porch, showed the same error?" Mr. Dawes nodded slowly. "It did, and it was amended as well, in my own hand, at the same time I corrected the register." "So anyone who had seen the notice during the posting period would have seen the 27th, said Miss Marple, "and then, on the day itself, they would have seen it changed to the 28th. "Precisely," said Mr. Dawes, "which is why I have come to you. It may mean nothing at all, but it troubles me nonetheless, particularly given what has happened since." Miss Marple looked down at the register once more, at the careful correction in ink not yet fully faded. "I think you are right to be troubled here, Mr. Dawes. In my experience of workers, when attention is drawn to small details at significant moments, it is often because those details matter more than they appear to. The question is not whether the correction was important, but why it needed to be made so late, and why Mrs. March was so concerned to see it done properly." After Mr. Dawes had departed, carrying his register with the same care he had brought it, Dolly turned to Miss Marple with the expression of one thoroughly mystified. "I cannot make head nor tail of it, Jane. A date changed by one day, and that concerns you?" "It concerns me," said Miss Marple quietly, "because someone went to considerable trouble to ensure that the official record showed the 28th and not the 27th. And if dates mattered so much before the wedding, one must wonder what other dates might have been important, and how far back one must look to find them." She rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the peaceful summer garden. "I think," she said, almost up to herself, "that we are dealing not with a sudden flight, but with something planned very carefully indeed. And the planning began not on the day of the wedding, but much earlier, perhaps years earlier." Chapter 4: The Brooch Returned Unworn. The Morning Post arrived at the March household on the third day following the wedding, and among the letters of condolence and inquiry was a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Mrs. Eleanor March opened it in the breakfast room, while her husband attended to his toast and newspaper with the determined absorption of a man who preferred not to be drawn into difficult conversations before noon. The parcel contained a brooch, a small piece of garnet set in silver, wrapped carefully in tissue paper. With it was a note in Clara's clear, upright hand. Miss Marple learned of this development when de Haydock called at the manor later that morning. He had been attending to a patient in the village, and had stopped, as he often did, to share what he had observed. "Eleanor March showed me the brooch," he said, accepting the tea that Dolly poured for him. "A family piece, apparently, lent to Clara on the morning of the wedding. It has been returned with a note of thanks, but no explanation whatsoever." "Returned?" said Miss Marple. "Then Clara has been in contact with her aunt." "Not directly," said de Haydock. "The parcel was posted from the market town 2 days ago, according to the postmark. No return address, of course." "What did the note say?" asked Dolly, leaning forward with interest. Dr. Haydock drew a folded paper from his pocket. "Eleanor gave me a copy. She thought it might be relevant to the investigation, though Inspector Slack seemed to think it merely confirmed that Clara has run off of her own accord. He unfolded the paper and read aloud. "Dear Aunt Eleanor, I return the brooch with my thanks. I am sorry I could not wear it as intended. Please forgive me. Clara." "How extraordinary," murmured Dolly. "Why return it at all, and why apologise for not wearing it?" Miss Marple had taken the paper from Dr. Haydock and was studying it with close attention. The handwriting was steady, showing no sign of haste or distress. The words were carefully chosen, polite but distant, as one might write to an acquaintance rather than to the aunt who had raised one. "May I ask," said Miss Marple, "when the brooch was lent to Clara, and under what circumstances?" "On the morning of the wedding," said Dr. Haydock. "Eleanor told me that Clara had chosen quite simple jewellery for the occasion, merely a strand of pearls that had belonged to her mother. Eleanor thought the garnets would complement the cream of the dress nicely, and offered to lend them. Clara accepted, or so Eleanor believed." "But she did not wear them," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Apparently not. When Eleanor examined the brooch after receiving it back, she noticed that the clasp showed no marks of recent use, no slight scratches, no minute changes in the pin that would indicate it had been fastened and unfastened. The piece looks exactly as it did when she lent it." Miss Marple turned the paper over, though the reverse was blank. "So Clara accepted the brooch, thanked her aunt for it, and then chose not to wear it, and now she returns it with an apology." "Eleanor is quite distressed about it," said Dr. Haydock. "Not about the brooch itself, you understand, but about what it might signify. She keeps saying that Clara was always so considerate, always so careful not to give offence." "Did Mrs. March say when exactly she lent the brooch?" asked Miss Marple. "Was it early in the morning or later?" Dr. Haydock considered. "I believe she said it was around mid-morning when Clara was dressing at the house. Eleanor brought it to her room and pinned it on herself, or at least she thought she had, but now she wonders if Clara removed it afterward, when she was alone." "That would suggest," said Dolly slowly, "that Clara did not wish to refuse the brooch to Eleanor's face, but had no intention of wearing it." "Precisely," said Miss Marple, "and that raises the question of why a young woman, preparing for her wedding, might choose not to wear a particular ornament for any number of reasons. Perhaps it did not suit the dress as well as expected. Perhaps she had already settled on the pearls and felt additional jewellery would be excessive, but in that case why accept it at all? And why return it now with such particular emphasis on not having worn it?" She rose and walked to the window, the note still in her hand. The garden beyond was bright with summer growth, and somewhere in the shrubbery a thrush was singing. After a moment she spoke again, her voice soft and reflective. "Borrowed things," she said, "carry with them a certain obligation. When we borrow, we enter into a compact of sorts. We accept the trust of the lender, and we undertake to return what was lent in the same condition we received it. But there is more to it than that. We also accept, in some small way, the associations that come with the borrowed object. If I borrow a hat from a friend, I carry with me not just the hat itself, but the connection to my friend, the implicit approval of my purpose in borrowing it." "You think Clara rejected the brooch because of what it represented," said de Haydock. "I think," said Mr. Marple carefully, "that Clara chose not to carry anything into her marriage that had been borrowed. The veil, which belonged to her, and was part of her trousseau, she folded and left behind. But the brooch which was lent, she could not wear at all. She returned it unworn because to have worn it, even for a moment, would have been to accept something she had already decided to refuse." "But what could that be?" asked Dolly. "It is only a brooch." "It is a family piece," said Miss Marple, "and family pieces carry with them the weight of family expectations, family history, family obligations. I knew a young woman once in St. Mary Mead who refused to wear her grandmother's wedding ring, though it had been offered with the greatest affection. It was not the ring itself she refused, but the pattern of life that the ring represented. She could not accept the one without accepting the other." Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. "You think Clara was rejecting her family? or at least some aspect of her family's expectations. "I think she was choosing to walk forward without carrying what had been offered to her," said Miss Marple. "And that's a very different thing from rejection. It suggests not anger or estrangement, but a kind of clarity. She knew what she could carry and what she could not." She returned to her chair and set the note aside. "The apology is interesting too. Please forgive me. Not, I am sorry for any inconvenience, or I regret the confusion. But please forgive me, which implies a wrong done, an offence given. What offence could there be in choosing not to wear a brooch?" "Unless," said Dr. Haydock, "the offence lay not in the choice itself, but in what that choice revealed. If Eleanor understood the significance of the returned brooch, she would know that Clara had made a decision that went far beyond mere ornamentation." "Exactly so," said Miss Marple, "and I suspect that Mrs. March understands it very well indeed. The question is what she chooses to do with that understanding." They sat in silence for a moment, each occupied with their own thoughts. Finally, Dolly spoke, her voice troubled. "Do you think Clara is safe, Jane? All of this careful planning, these deliberate gestures, they suggest control and purpose, but they also suggest a young woman under considerable strain." Miss Marple's expression softened. "I think Clara's doing precisely what she believes she must do. Whether that will lead to safety or to further difficulty, I cannot yet say, but I do not believe she has acted from despair or confusion. Everything we have learned suggests the opposite. She has chosen her path with great care, and she is following it with determination, even though it means leaving behind her marriage, her family, her place in the village," said Dr. Haydock quietly. "Especially because of that," said Miss Marple. "Sometimes the hardest thing is not to disappear, but to reappear as oneself, unburdened by what others have lent or given or imposed. I think that is what Clara is attempting to do." She looked down at the note once more, at the careful script and the simple words. "The brooch was returned unworn because borrowed dignity, borrowed identity, borrowed respectability cannot be carried into an honest life. And I think, though I cannot yet prove it, that Clara has chosen honesty over everything else, no matter what the cost." Chapter 5, A Lantern Below the Marl. The matter of the lantern came to light in the casual way that so many significant details do, mentioned almost as an afterthought during an otherwise unremarkable conversation. Miss Marple and Lady Bantry had driven into Alderwick that afternoon to call upon the vicar's wife, who had been unwell, and while returning to the motor car they encountered Mr. Hugh March, walking up from the lower end of the village with a basket of vegetables from his garden. He greeted them with his customary geniality, and a conversation ensued regarding the weather, the state of the roads, and the general health of the parish. It was only when Dolly asked after Mrs. March that his cheerful expression clouded somewhat. "Eleanor is managing as well as can be expected," he said, setting down his basket to wipe his brow. "Though of course all this business with Clara weighs upon her terribly, and now there is this odd matter of the lantern which has her quite perplexed." "The lantern?" said Miss Marple gently. Mr. March seemed to realise he had spoken of something not yet generally known, and he hesitated, but his natural inclination toward openness prevailed, and after a moment he continued. "It seems one of the farm hands, young Jessup from the Tate place, reported seeing a light below the marl cuttings on the evening of the wedding. He thought nothing of it at the time, assumed it was someone looking for a strayed sheep or some such thing. But when he mentioned it to his father yesterday, old Tate thought it worth passing along to Inspector Slack." "A light below the marl," said Dolly. "That is odd, surely. There is nothing down there except rough ground and old diggings." "Precisely what the inspector said," agreed Mr. March. "He questioned young Jessup quite closely. The boy insisted he saw it clearly, around dusk or just after, a lantern being carried along the bottom of the cutting. Not moving quickly, he said, but deliberately, as though whoever held it was looking for something or perhaps waiting." Miss Marple's expression had become very still. "Did the boy see who was carrying the lantern?" "No, the distance was too great and the light was fading. He saw only the lantern itself moving slowly." He watched it for a few minutes, and then he went about his business. By the time he looked again, it was gone. "And the lantern," said Miss Marple quietly. "Did it belong to anyone in particular?" Mr. March looked uncomfortable. That is what has Eleanor so troubled. When Inspector Slack made inquiries about who might have been in that area with a lantern, Eleanor recalled that one of ours had gone missing that evening. A good oil lantern we keep by the back door for when we need to go out to the hen house after dark. She noticed it was gone when she went to check on the hens before retiring, and it reappeared the next morning, returned to its usual place. "Returned?" repeated Miss Marple. "By whom?" "That is just it," said Mr. March. "We do not know. Eleanor asked the household, but no one admitted to taking it, and when she examined it, she found the wick had been trimmed, which suggested it had been used and then carefully attended to afterward." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a forced lightness that did not quite succeed in its purpose. "I told Eleanor it was probably just some village lad playing about, or perhaps one of the search party who borrowed it during the night. These things happen. No need to make a great mystery of it." But Miss Marple could see that he did not quite believe his own explanation, and that the return of the lantern troubled him more than he wished to acknowledge. After Mr. March had departed with his basket and his determinedly cheerful manner, Dolly turned to Miss Marple with raised eyebrows. "Children playing about? In the marl cuttings at dusk on a wedding day? He cannot truly believe that," said Miss Marple, said Miss thoughtfully. "I do not think he does. But Mr. March is a man who prefers difficulties to resolve themselves without his active involvement. He would much rather believe in a simple explanation than pursue a complicated one." They walked slowly back to the motor car, but Miss Marple's mind was occupied with the image of a lantern moving deliberately along the bottom of the old marl cuttings, in a place where no path ran and no ordinary errand would lead. She thought of the veil folded on the wall above, and of the visibility from that vantage point, and a picture began to form in her mind of two people signalling to each other across the gathering darkness. That evening after dinner she spoke of it to Dolly as they sat in the drawing room with their coffee. "A lantern placed where it can be seen from above," she said, "is not being used to light one's own way. It is being used as a signal." "A signal to Clara on the wall," said Dolly. "But who would be signalling her, and why?" "That is the question," said to Miss Marple. "But consider the sequence of events. Clara leaves the church alone, walks to the stone wall above the marl cuttings, and folds her veil carefully. Someone below carries a lantern to a place where there is no reason to be, at precisely the time when Clara would be visible above. And afterward, the lantern is returned to the March household, cleaned and trimmed as though to erase any trace of its use." "You think Eleanor was involved?" said Dolly slowly. "I think someone in that household knew the lantern had been taken, knew where it had gone, and ensured its return," said Miss Marple. "Whether that person was Eleanor herself, or someone acting with her knowledge, I cannot yet say, but the lantern did not walk down to the marl cuttings of its own accord." She set down her cup with a soft click against the saucer. "There is a kind of signalling that takes place between people who share a secret understanding. A lantern, lit in a particular place at a particular time, can convey a message as clearly as words. It might mean I'm here, or all is ready, or now's the time. Whatever message this lantern carried, it was important enough for someone to risk being seen, and careful enough to ensure no obvious evidence remained. But if Eleanor was helping Clara to disappear," said Dolly, "why would she be troubled by the lantern's return? Surely she would be relieved to have it back safely." "Unless," said Miss Marple, "she had not expected the matter to be discovered at all. Young Jessop's report was accidental, unplanned for. If Eleanor had arranged for the lantern to be used as a signal, she would have assumed no one noticed its absence or its use. The fact that someone did notice and that the inspector now knows of it changes everything." She rose and walked to the window, though there was nothing to see but the reflection of the lighted room against the darkness outside. "I have been thinking about Mrs. March a great deal these past days. She is a woman of strong character and considerable capability. She has raised Clara from childhood, guided her, protected her, and now Clara has vanished, leaving behind only careful gestures and mysterious signals. If Eleanor knows where Clara's gone, she is carrying that knowledge with great strain. "Do you think she does know?" asked Dolly. Miss Marple turned back to face her. "I think she knows more than she has yet said. The amended marriage notice, the brooch lent and returned unworn, and now the lantern taken and carefully replaced. These are not random occurrences. They form a pattern, and at the centre of that pattern is a woman who has been keeping secrets for a very long time." "What sort of secrets?" "The sort," said Miss Marple quietly, "that require years of vigilance to maintain, and that can only be protected by ensuring certain dates align, certain ornaments are not worn, and certain signals are sent at dusk to confirm that what must be done is finally being done." She returned to her chair and took up her knitting, a piece of work she had brought with her, and which served to occupy her hands while her mind worked through difficulties. The needles clicked softly in the quiet room. "I knew a woman once," she said after a moment, "who maintained a secret correspondence for 30 years. Her family believed she had no contact with a certain person, and she allowed them to believe it. But twice a year, on specific dates, a lantern would appear in a particular window. To anyone else it was simply a light. To the person watching it meant, 'All is well, I have not forgotten, the promise still holds.' Such signals can carry entire histories in their small flames." "You think the lantern below the Marle was that sort of signal?" said Dolly. "A message about promises and histories?" "I think," said Mr. Marple, "that Clara did not walk away from her wedding on a sudden impulse. I think she walked towards something that had been arranged with great care, and that the lantern was the final confirmation that all was ready for her to go. And I think Eleanor March, who has borne the burden of protecting Clara for so many years, finally allowed her to step free." Chapter 6. Words Not Meant for the Groom. It was de Haydock who brought Mr. Thomas Reed to the manor house on the 5th day after the wedding that was not. The young man had been staying at the village inn since the disappearance, unable to face the house that had been prepared for his married life, and unwilling to return to London while the mystery remained unsolved. Dr. Haydock had found him sitting in the inn's small parlour, with the air of one who has exhausted all other resources and does not know where to turn next. "I thought perhaps Miss Marple might speak with him, Dr. Cotia, so Dr. Haydock had been said quietly to Dolly when he arrived. "He has remembered something that troubles him, and I believe he needs to speak of it to someone who will listen without judgment." They received Mr. Reed in the morning room. He was thinner than he had been at the wedding, his face drawn with sleeplessness and worry, but he carried himself with the dignity of a man determined not to collapse under the weight of his circumstances. "I am grateful for your kindness," he said, accepting the chair that Dolly offered. "I know I have no claim upon your time, but Dr. Haydock assured me you would not find my visit an imposition." "Not at all," said Mrs. Marple gently. "We have been most concerned for you, Mr. Reed. This has been a terrible ordeal." He nodded, looking down at his hands. "I have been over it again and again in my mind, trying to understand what I might have missed, what signs I failed to see, and there was something, I think, though I did not recognize its importance at the time." "Will you tell us?" said Miss Marple. Mr. Reed drew a breath. "It was on the afternoon of the wedding, perhaps 2 hours before the service. Clara and I were alone for a few minutes in the garden at the March house. Everyone else was occupied with preparations, and we had stepped outside for a moment's quiet. I thought she seemed pensive, and I asked if she was nervous about the wedding. She smiled and said no. She was not nervous." He paused, and when he continued his voice was careful, as though he were trying to remember the exact words. Then she said something that struck me as odd, though I dismissed it as wedding day nerves. She asked me whether I would forgive something long finished that had never truly begun. Miss Marple's needles, which had been moving steadily through her knitting, became very still. "Those were her exact words?" she asked. As near as I can remember them, yes. Something long finished that had never truly begun. I asked her what she meant, but she only shook her head and said it was nothing, only a foolish thought. I assumed she was speaking of some minor regret, perhaps a friendship that had ended badly, or opportunity not taken. I told her that, of course, I would forgive anything in her past, that we all had things we wished we had done differently. And what did she say to that? Asked Dolly. She thanked me, said Mr. Reed, quietly. And then she said that I was very kind, and that she hoped I would always think well of her. At the time, I thought it was a touching sentiment. Now I wonder if she was trying to tell me something I was too foolish to hear. He looked up, and there was real anguish in his eyes. I knew so little of her past, you see. She was always reserved about her earlier years, and I respected that reserve. I thought there would be time after we were married for her to share whatever she wished to share. But perhaps that was the problem. Perhaps she could not marry me precisely because there were things she could not share. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and folded her hands in her lap. Mr. Reed, she said. Did you ever meet Clara's parents? Her father died several years ago, he said. Her mother I never knew. Clara said very little about her, only that she had died when Clara was quite young, and that she had been raised by her aunt and uncle from the age of 12 or so. And you never thought to inquire further? Mr. Reed flushed slightly. I did ask once or twice, but Clara became quiet when the subject arose, and I did not wish to press her. I thought that grief was a private matter, and that if she wished to speak of it, she would in her own time. You are not alone in that, said Miss Marple kindly. Many people find it easier to avoid difficult subjects than to pursue them, but sometimes what is not said matters more than what is. Whodunit, who had been standing by the window, spoke up. There is more, I think. After Mr. Reed told me of this conversation, I thought it worth speaking to Mrs. March. She admitted that Clara had a private conversation with her as well, on the morning of the wedding. Did she say what was discussed? Asked Dolly. Only that Clara asked after an old family matter, something that Mrs. March described as having been settled years ago. She would not elaborate further, but I had distinct impression that the matter in question was one of considerable delicacy. Miss Marple turned to Mr. Reed. When Clara spoke of something that had never truly begun, do you think she might have been speaking of a relationship? An attachment, perhaps, that was prevented or discouraged? Mr. Reed looked startled. You mean another man? I suppose it is possible, but surely if there had been someone else, she would not have agreed to marry me. Clara was not the sort to be cruel or deceitful. No, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. I do not think she was cruel at all, but sometimes the most difficult cruelty is the one we inflict upon ourselves, when we try to live in a way that contradicts what we know to be true. She rose and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where roses bloomed in ordered profusion. Something that had never truly begun, she repeated softly. That is a curious phrase. It suggests not an ending, but something that was prevented from starting. Life perhaps that circumstances made impossible. Mr. Reed shook his head, bewildered. I do not understand. Nor do I, entirely, admitted Miss Marple, but I'm beginning to see the shape of it. Clara asked you about forgiveness for something in the past. She spoke with her aunt about an old family matter. She refused to wear the borrowed brooch. She altered the wedding date, or allowed it to be altered. All of these things suggest a woman trying to untangle herself from a history that others wish to keep hidden. She turned back to face them. Mr. Reed, I must ask you something that may seem impertinent. When you and Clara became engaged, did she seem entirely happy about it, or was there something hesitant in her acceptance? He thought for a long moment. She was not, I think, as joyful as I had expected, but she was calm and certain. She said yes without hesitation, and in the weeks that followed, she made all the necessary arrangements with perfect efficiency. I thought she was simply practical by nature, not given to displays of emotion. And it never occurred to you that her certainty might have been born not of happiness, but of resignation," said Miss Marple gently. The words hung in the air, and Mr. Reed's face grew pale. "You think she married me because she felt she had no other choice?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that Clara may have believed marriage to you was the only way to put her past behind her, to become respectable and ordinary and safe. But I also think that when the moment came, she could not go through with it. Not because she did not care for you, but because she realized that building a life on concealment would be no life at all." Dr. Haydock spoke quietly. The question she asked you, Reed, about forgiveness for something long finished that had never truly begun, that was not about an old romance. It was about something more fundamental than that. "Then what was it?" asked Mr. Reed almost desperately. Miss Marple's expression was deeply compassionate. "I believe it was about a child." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birdsong from the garden seemed to pause, as though the world itself held its breath. "A child," whispered Mr. Reed. "Something that had never truly begun," said Miss Marple. "A life that was prevented, or hidden, or given away. Something that ended before it could properly start, but that shaped everything that came after. Clara was asking whether you could forgive her for a past that included such a thing. And when you assured her that you could forgive anything, I think she realized that you did not truly understand what you were forgiving." She sat down again, her movements slow and deliberate. "I cannot be certain, of course, but in my experience, when young women disappear rather than marry, and when families guard old secrets with such care, the secret often involves a child born outside marriage, and the great shame and difficulty that followed." Mr. Reed sat motionless, absorbing this. Finally he said, "If that is true, why did she not simply tell me? I would not have judged her. I would have understood." "Would you, asked Miss Marple not unkindly. "Or would you have said the words of understanding while feeling the weight of the knowledge? Would you have been able to forget it entirely, never to wonder about it, never to think less of her for it?" Clara could not take that risk. She chose instead to walk away, to spare both of you the burden of a marriage built on half-truths and incomplete forgiveness. Mr. Reed rose and walked to the window, his back to them all. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Then I have lost her not because she did not care, but because she cared too much to deceive me." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "I believe that is exactly what has happened." Chapter 7. The Promise Made Before the War. Mrs. Eleanor March came to the manor house that same evening, arriving just as the last light was fading from the sky. She had not sent word ahead, and when she was shown into the drawing-room where Miss Marple and Lady Bantry sat with their after-dinner coffee, her face bore the marks of a decision made after long struggle. "I must speak with you," she said without preamble. "Dr. Haydock told me that Mr. Reed was here this morning, and that certain conclusions have been drawn. I cannot allow those conclusions to stand unchallenged, nor can I remain silent any longer, while Clara is judged by those who do not know the full truth." "Please sit down, Mrs. March," said Miss Marple gently. "We are glad you have come." Eleanor took the offered chair, but remained upright, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a long moment she sat in silence, gathering herself. When she spoke, her voice was controlled, but carried within it the weight of years. "Clara was not quite 17 when it happened," she began. "It was the spring of 1939, just before the war changed everything. She had taken a position as companion to an elderly lady in the next county, a respectable situation that we thought would be good for her. The lady's nephew visited frequently from London. He was older, married, a man of position and reputation. Clara was innocent and flattered by his attention." She paused, and Miss Marple saw the pain in her expression, the old anger and helplessness that mothers and guardians carry when those in their care are harmed. "He was careful, of course," Eleanor continued bitterly. "He made promises he never intended to keep, spoke of love while ensuring there would be no scandal attached to his own name. When Clara realized she was with child, she came to us in desperation. She was terrified, ashamed, certain her life was over." "What did you do?" asked Dolly quietly. "What could we do?" said Eleanor. We could not expose the man without destroying Clara utterly in the process. Society does not forgive young women such mistakes, no matter how innocent or how deceived. We sent her away to a place where such things are managed discreetly. The child was born in January of 1940, a boy. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her eyes were deeply attentive. And the child? Given to a family who could raise him properly, said Eleanor. It was arranged through the institution. We were told it was a good family, respectable, unable to have children of their own. Clara was allowed to hold him only once, and then he was gone. She never saw him again, never knew his name or where he was taken. How terrible, murmured Dolly. Eleanor's composure wavered. You cannot imagine what it was like. Clara was 18 years old, and she returned to us hollow and silent. For months she barely spoke, but gradually, slowly she rebuilt herself. She took up her duties, helping her father, who was ill by then. She became useful, capable, the person everyone relied upon, and we, Hugh and I, we protected her secret absolutely. We told everyone she had been away taking a course in household management. No one questioned it. The promise of silence, said Miss Marple. Yes, said Eleanor. Oh, we promised each other, all three of us, that we would never speak of it again, that Clara would have a chance at a normal life, an honest life, if we could only keep the past buried. And for 17 years we did exactly that. Clara never mentioned it, never allowed herself to dwell on what had happened. She made a life here, quiet and respectable, and if she never seemed entirely happy, well, many people are not happy, and they manage well enough. She looked up, meeting Miss Marple's gaze directly. When Thomas Reed began courting her 2 years ago, I thought it was the answer to everything. He was decent, kind, steady. He knew nothing of Clara's past, and there seemed no reason he ever needed to know. The promise could continue, could protect her even in marriage. I encouraged the match perhaps more than I should have done. But Clara had doubts, said Miss Marple. She never said so directly, Eleanor admitted. But I saw it in small things, the way she hesitated before accepting his proposal, the way she smiled at everyone except him. I told myself she was simply cautious, that she would grow to love him in time. I wanted so desperately for her to have the security and respectability that marriage would bring. And the wedding date? Asked Miss Marple. The correction in the parish register? Eleanor's hands tightened. That was my doing. When the notice was first posted, it showed the 27th of June. I noticed it immediately because the 27th is exactly 17 years and 5 months from the date the child was born. Anyone who knew both dates might begin to count backward, to wonder about the timing. It was probably foolish to worry about such a thing, but I could not bear the thought of even the smallest risk. I convinced Mr. Dawes that there had been an error, had him change it to the 28th. You were trying to protect Clara even from the mathematics of memory, said Mr. Marple softly. Yes, said Eleanor, though I see now that I was protecting not Clara, but myself. I was protecting the promise, the silence we had maintained for so long. I had convinced myself that if we could only keep the secret a little longer, through the wedding and into married life, then it would truly be in the past. Clara could be Mrs. Reed, and the girl who bore a child at 18 would cease to exist. She drew a shaking breath. But Clara knew better. She knew that marrying Thomas while carrying such a secret would be building her life on a foundation of untruth. The brooch I lent her, the family heirloom, she could not wear it because she understood what I did not, that borrowed dignity is no dignity at all. She had to choose between the life I wanted for her and the life she could live with honesty. The lantern below the Marple, said Miss Marple. That was your doing as well. Eleanor nodded slowly. Clara came to me 3 days before the wedding and told me she could not go through with it. She said she had made arrangements, that she would leave quietly and take up a new life under her own name, where no one knew her history, and she would not have to live a lie. She asked only that I help her leave without causing Thomas more pain than necessary. So you arranged the signal, said Dolly. A friend of mine, said Eleanor carefully, Someone who had helped us during the difficult time before agreed to wait with a motorcar below the Marle cuttings. The lantern was the signal that Clara was ready, that the way was clear. I took it myself and walked down to ensure everything was in place. Then I returned it to the house and said nothing. "You allowed everyone to search 'em," said Miss Marple. "You allowed Mr. Reed to suffer the agony of not knowing." "I did," said Eleanor, and now tears stood in her eyes. "And I have barely slept since, carrying the knowledge of what I had done. But Clara begged me to give her time, to let her reach safety before the truth was known. She said she would write when she was settled, that she would explain everything. I kept my promise to her one final time." The room was very quiet. Outside, a night bird called, its voice lonely in the darkness. "Mrs. March," said Miss Marple at length, "you have carried a heavy burden for many years, but I think you must see that protecting Clara from the consequences of truth is not the same as protecting her from harm. She chose to leave because living with honesty, even in exile, was better than living with silence in false respectability." Eleanor wiped her eyes. "I know that now. I know that I was wrong to push her toward marriage, wrong to believe that hiding the past was the same as healing from it. But knowing it and living with it are different things." "They are indeed," said Mr. Marple gently. "And now you must decide what to do with the knowledge you carry." Chapter 8. Account settled quietly. The following morning brought Inspector Slack to the manor house in a state of barely suppressed irritation. He had been summoned, he explained, by Mrs. March herself, who had indicated that she had information material to the investigation. He had found her at the March household in the company of her husband, who sat pale and silent while Eleanor spoke with a composure that seemed born of exhausted relief. "She has confessed the lot," Inspector Slack announced to Miss Marple and Lady Bantry, who had been asked to attend at Eleanor's request. "The whole arrangement from start to finish. I must say, it is not what I expected." They gathered in the drawing-room of the manor, a neutral ground that Eleanor had requested. She sat with the same upright bearing she had shown the previous evening, but there was something different in her face now, a kind of peace that came from setting down a burden too long carried. "I have told Inspector Slack everything I told you last night," she said to Miss Marple, "but there are details of the actual departure that I did not fully explain. I think it is time those were made clear as well." Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with the air of a man determined to establish facts in proper order. "Mrs. March has stated that she met Miss Hewson at the stone wall above the Marle cuttings at approximately 7:30 on the evening of the wedding. Is that correct?" "Yes," said Eleanor. "Clara left the church shortly after 7, as you know. She walked directly to the wall. I'd gone down earlier, while the service was still in progress, to ensure the lantern was in place and that our friend was waiting below with the motorcar." "This friend," said Inspector Slack, "you will need to provide the name." "Mrs. Violet Ashford," said Eleanor without hesitation. "She runs a boarding house in Dorset, near the coast. She helped us when Clara was expecting the child, provided a safe place for her to stay. She has remained a friend to Clara ever since, corresponding with her, occasionally offering support that I could not always give." Miss Marple nodded slightly, as though this confirmed something she had already surmised. Eleanor continued. "When Clara decided she could not go through with the marriage, she wrote to Mrs. Ashford. Violet agreed to help her make a fresh start, to take her in until she could find work and lodging of her own. The arrangement was that Violet would drive from Dorset on the day of the wedding and wait at the bottom of the Marle cuttings. The lantern was to signal that all was ready." "And you placed this lantern yourself," said Inspector Slack. "I did. I walked down during the service, lit it, and left it where it could be seen from above. Then I returned to the church in time for the end of the ceremony. No one noticed my absence, or if they did, they assumed I was attending to some last detail of the reception. Most irregular," muttered Inspector Slack. "Most necessary," said Eleanor firmly. "Clara needed to know that she had a way to leave, that she was not trapped. When she stepped outside after the service, she walked to the wall. I met her there as we had arranged." "What passed between you?" asked Miss Marple gently. Eleanor's expression softened with memory. "She thanked me. She said she knew I'd wanted better for her, that she was sorry to disappoint me. I told her, though perhaps too late, that her happiness mattered more than my idea of respectability. We stood together for a few moments, looking down at the lantern below. She asked me to tell Thomas that she had cared for him, that he deserved honesty she could not give while bound to secrecy. "And then," prompted Dolly. She folded her veil very carefully and laid it on the wall. She said she was leaving it behind because it represented something she could never be. The innocent bride with no past to hide. She wanted to walk forward, carrying only what was truly hers. Then she made her way down the old sheep track that runs along the side of the cuttings. It is steep and difficult, but Clara knew it from childhood. Violet was waiting in the motor car on the farm track below. "You watched her go," said Miss Marple. "I did," said Eleanor. "I watched until the motor car pulled away and the lantern, which Violet extinguished before leaving, went dark. Then I walked back to the church. By the time I arrived, people were beginning to search." Inspector Slack frowned at his notes. "You allowed the search to continue. You allowed us to waste time and resources looking for someone you knew to be safe." "I did," said Eleanor, meeting his gaze steadily. "And I would do it again, because Clara asked me for time to reach safety before the truth became known. I gave her 3 days. That was all she needed." "And the brooch?" asked Miss Marple. "You said she returned it unworn." "She gave it to me before she left," said Eleanor. "She took it from her bag and pressed it into my hand. She said she could not wear something borrowed into a life built on her own truth." I understood then, fully, what I had not wanted to see before, that Clara was not running away from responsibility but toward it. She was choosing to live with what she had done, to acknowledge her past rather than bury it under the respectability of marriage. "She posted the brooch back to you afterward," said Miss Marple. "For the record, I expect," said Eleanor. "So there would be evidence that she had not taken it, that she had fulfilled her obligations even in departure. Clara is careful about such things. She always has been." Hugh March, who had been silent throughout, spoke for the first time. "I knew nothing of the arrangement. Eleanor told me only after the fact. I have been angry with her for the deception, but I cannot deny that she acted from love, however misguided." Eleanor looked at her husband with tired gratitude. "I should have told you beforehand. I should have trusted you to understand, but I was so accustomed to carrying the secret alone that I could not imagine sharing it." Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "Well, Mrs. March, I cannot say I approve of your methods. Interfering with an investigation, withholding information, these are serious matters. However, no crime has been committed. Miss Hewson is of age, left of her own free will, and appears to be safe. I cannot prosecute you for helping her leave, though I would have appreciated honesty from the start." "I understand," said Eleanor, "and I am prepared to face whatever consequences there may be." "The consequences," said Miss Marple quietly, "will be primarily social rather than legal, I think. Alderwick will need to absorb the truth, and that will take time." Eleanor nodded. "Let them know what they will. I am tired of secrets. Clara chose honesty, and I must do the same." Inspector Slack rose to leave, then paused. "This Mrs. Ashford in Dorset, you will provide her full address?" "I will," said Eleanor, "though I doubt you will need it. Clara has already written to me that she is safe and settling into her new situation. She asked that the truth be told, that Thomas be released from any false hope, and that she be allowed to live quietly under her own name without pursuit." "A sensible request," said Miss Marple, "and one that I hope will be honoured." As Inspector Slack departed, Eleanor turned to Miss Marple with something approaching a smile. "You knew, didn't you? From very early on, you understood what had happened." "I suspected," said Miss Marple. "The pieces suggested a disappearance that was careful rather than desperate, planned rather than impulsive, and the care taken over small details, the veil folded, the brooch returned, the date corrected, all spoke of someone settling accounts as honestly as circumstances allowed." "Clara settling her accounts," said Eleanor, softly. Yes, that is exactly what she's done. Chapter 9, When the Past is Named Aloud. The letter arrived on the 7th day, delivered by the morning post to the March household. Eleanor brought it to the manor that same afternoon, her face bearing the marks of sleepless nights, but also something approaching serenity. She handed it to Miss Marple without ceremony. "Clara has written," she said simply. "She asks that I share it with those who have been concerned for her welfare. I think that includes you, Miss Marple, and you, Lady Bantry, more than she perhaps knows." The letter was written on plain paper in Clara's clear hand, the script steady and without embellishment. Miss Marple read it aloud at Eleanor's request, her voice quiet in the peaceful afternoon room. "Dear Aunt Eleanor, I write to let you know that I have arrived safely and am settled in lodgings in a coastal town where I have taken a position as assistant to a solicitor's clerk. It is humble work, but honest, and I am known here only as Miss Hewson, a woman seeking employment after the death of her father. No one asks about my past, and I volunteer nothing. I know that my departure has caused pain and confusion, and for that I'm deeply sorry. But I could not marry Thomas while carrying the weight of what I had concealed. He deserved a wife who could meet him with full honesty, and I could not be that wife while bound to silence about the most significant event of my life. I ask no pursuit and no forgiveness, only that the truth be spoken kindly. Thomas should know that I cared for him, that his kindness and steadiness were real gifts to me. But I could not accept those gifts while offering only a partial version of myself in return. As for the past that I have carried these 17 years, I think it is time it was named aloud, if only so that it might finally rest. I was 17 when I bore a child, a boy, whose existence has been hidden to protect my respectability. I do not know where he is or what name he carries, but I have thought of him every day since. To marry while pretending he had never existed would have been to deny him a second time, and I could not do that. I am learning here in this quiet place by the sea what it means to live with what is true, rather than what is convenient. It is harder and simpler than I expected. I ask only to be allowed to continue in peace. Your niece, Clara." The room was silent when Miss Marple finished reading. Eleanor sat with her hands folded, looking out at the garden where summer flowers nodded in the breeze. "She has found her courage," said Eleanor at last. "The courage I tried to take from her by insisting on silence." "You acted from love," said Dolly gently. "However mistaken, it was love that guided you." "Love can be a kind of tyranny," said Eleanor. "I see that now. I loved Clara so much that I wanted to protect her from every consequence, every difficulty. But in doing so, I taught her to hide rather than to heal." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. "What will you do now?" "I will do what Clara asks," said Eleanor. "I will speak the truth, openly and without shame. Inspector Slack will need to be informed, and Thomas deserves to hear it from me rather than through village gossip. And then, I suppose, Alderwick will judge us as it sees fit." The reckoning came that evening in the front parlour of the March house, where Eleanor had asked Inspector Slack, Mr. Reed, de Haydock, and the vicar to gather. Miss Marple and Lady Bantry were present at Eleanor's request, as witnesses to what she called the settling of accounts. Eleanor stood before them and spoke without notes or hesitation, her voice steady as she recounted the history she had guarded for so long. She told of Clara's youth and innocence, of the man who had exploited that innocence, of the child born and given away. She spoke of the years of silence, the promise made to protect Clara's future, and finally of the wedding that could not take place, because honesty mattered more than respectability. When she finished, the room remained quiet. Mr. Reed sat with his head bowed, his hands gripping his knees. Inspector Slack stared at his notebook as though the familiar lines of his own handwriting might provide guidance. The vicar, a man who had seen much of human frailty in his years of service, looked thoughtful and sanable. It was Dr. Haydock who spoke first. "Mrs. March, I will not pretend that what you have told us is easy to hear, but I have known you and Clara for many years, and I believe every word you have said. The question now is not what happened 17 years ago, but what we do with the knowledge today." Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "From a legal standpoint, there is no crime to prosecute. Miss Hewson left of her own free will, having reached her majority. Mrs. March's actions in assisting that departure, while irregular, do not constitute a criminal offence. The matter of the child, painful though it is, belongs to the past and is beyond the reach of the law." "Then there is nothing to be done?" asked the vicar. "Nothing official," said Inspector Slack, "though I expect the village will have much to say about it." Mr. Reed raised his head. "May I see the letter?" Eleanor handed it to him, and he read it slowly, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he folded it with care and returned it to her. "She wrote that she cared for me," he said quietly. "I will hold to that. As for the rest, I cannot pretend it does not hurt to know I was kept in ignorance. But I understand why she could not speak. I wish she had trusted me, but I respect her choice." "You are generous," said Eleanor, her voice thick with emotion. "I am practical," said Mr. Reed. "I have lost Clara either way. At least this way I know it was not from want of feeling, but from an excess of conscience." Miss Marple, who had been silent throughout, spoke now in her gentle way. "There is the matter of how this history will be received in Alderwick. Villages have long memories, and sometimes those memories are unkind." The vicar nodded. "That is my concern as well. I will speak to the parish, make clear that judgment is not our purpose, that compassion and understanding are what our faith requires of us. But I cannot control what people will say in their homes and at their gates." "Nor should you try," said Eleanor. "Clara chose honesty, knowing full well what it might cost her in reputation. I make the same choice now. Let people say what they will. I am done with pretending." "There is one other matter," said Miss Marple. "The child, now a young man of 17. Has any thought been given to him?" Eleanor's face contracted with pain. "I think of him often, but we were promised that his adoption was final and complete, that seeking him out would only disrupt his life and the life of his family. Clara and I agreed long ago that we had no right to intrude upon whatever peace he had found." "That may be wise," said Miss Marple, "though I have known cases where such secrets, when finally revealed, brought more relief than disruption. Perhaps one day, if he wishes to know his origins, the truth will be there for him." "Perhaps," said Eleanor softly. "Now that is his choice to make, not ours." Inspector Slack rose to leave, signalling that the official business, such as it was, had concluded. "I will make my report, stating that Miss Hewson has been located safely and has chosen to remain away of her own accord. I will note that the investigation is closed. The rest, as you say, is not a matter for the law." After he departed, the remaining group sat in the gathering dusk, each occupied with their own thoughts. Mr. Reed was the first to rise. "I will return to London tomorrow," he said. "There is nothing more for me here. I wish Clara well, truly, and I hope she finds the peace she seeks." Eleanor walked him to the door, and Miss Marple heard her say quietly, "You are a good man, Thomas. I am sorry we could not give you what you deserved." "You gave me honesty in the end," he replied. "That is something." When he had gone, Eleanor returned to her chair, looking suddenly exhausted. "It is done," she said. "The secret is spoken, the past is named. Now we must live with what comes after." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently, "but I think you will find that truth, however difficult, is easier to carry than silence, and Clara, wherever she is, will know that she is no longer alone in bearing the weight of what happened." Eleanor nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I failed her by trying to hide it. I will not fail her again by being ashamed of it." "That," said Miss Marple, "is perhaps the truest form of love." Chapter 10. What Remains After the Wedding. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding that was not, and Alderwick had settled into its new knowledge with the slow adjustment that villages make when the familiar must be seen in an altered light. Miss Marple, who had remained at the manor longer than originally planned at Dolly's insistence, observed the process with the quiet attention she brought to all matters of human accommodation. The talk, of course, had been considerable at first. There were those who spoke of scandal and shame, who wondered aloud what the world was coming to when young women could simply walk away from their obligations. But there were others, more than Miss Marple had expected, who remembered Clara's years of patient service to her ailing father, her quiet competence, her unfailing courtesy. These voices, softer but persistent, suggested that perhaps judgment might be tempered with understanding. The vicar had spoken from his pulpit on the Sunday following, Eleanor's confession, choosing his text from the Gospel of John. "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," he had read, and then he had spoken briefly but clearly about compassion, about the difference between condemnation and comprehension, about the difficulty of carrying burdens alone. It was not a sermon that mentioned Clara by name, but everyone understood its purpose, and more than a few in the congregation had found themselves examining their own lives with greater humility. Eleanor March had borne the scrutiny with remarkable steadiness. She went about her days as she always had, shopping in the village, tending church, tending her garden. When people whispered, she did not pretend not to notice, but neither did she retreat. She had made her confession and would stand by it, and there was a dignity in that stance that gradually commanded respect, even from those most inclined to disapprove. Hugh March, who had struggled initially with his wife's deception, had come to a kind of peace with it. Dr. Haydock, calling at the manor one morning, reported that he had seen Hugh and Eleanor walking together in the lanes, talking quietly, and that there was something in their manner that suggested not merely reconciliation, but a deeper understanding than they had known before. Secrets kept for the wrong reasons, Dr. Haydock observed, are like ailments left treated. They fester, but once brought into the light, the healing can begin. I think that is happening slowly for both of them. The parish register had been attended to with care. Mr. Peter Dawes had approached Eleanor to ask about the correction he had made to the wedding date, wondering now if there were other matters in the records that needed amendment. Eleanor had suggested gently that the original date of 27th had perhaps been correct after all, that her concern about the timing had been misplaced anxiety rather than genuine error. Mr. Dawes had agreed to restore the original entry and to note in his careful hand that the correction had been made in error. It was a small thing, but it meant that the official record would no longer carry the mark of Eleanor's attempt to obscure the mathematics of Clara's past. Details matter, Eleanor had told him, echoing her own words from weeks before, especially when they tell the truth. Of Thomas Reed there had been little news. He had indeed returned to London, and a brief note had arrived for Eleanor thanking her for her honesty and wishing Clara well. He had written that he bore no ill will, that he understood the impossible position Clara had been in, and that he hoped she would find the happiness that had eluded her in Alderwick. It was a generous letter, spare in its words but large in its spirit, and Eleanor had wept when she read it. "He is a better man than I deserved for Clara," she had said to Miss Marple. "I wish I had trusted him with the truth from the beginning. Perhaps things might have been different." "Perhaps," Miss Marple had replied. But I think Clara knew that the problem was not whether Thomas could forgive her past, but whether she could forgive herself while living a life built on concealment. That is a different question entirely. It was on a late afternoon in mid-July, as the summer reached its fullness and the gardens blazed with colour, that Miss Marple and Lady Bantry took one final walk through the village before Miss Marple's departure. They had called upon Eleanor, who had served them tea with her characteristic composure, and who had shown them a second letter from Clara. The letter reported that Clara had found her footing in a new life, that the work suited her, and that she had joined a small congregation where no one knew her history. She wrote of the sea which she could see from her window, and of the peace that came from living without pretence. She sent her love to her aunt and uncle, and her hope that they would forgive her for the pain her departure had caused. "She sounds settled," Dolly had observed. "She sounds herself," Eleanor had corrected gently. "For the first time in 17 years, she sounds like herself." Now, as Miss Marple and Dolly walked slowly down the lane toward the church, they spoke of what had transpired and what remained. "Do you think Clara will ever return to Alderwick?" asked Dolly. "I think that will depend on many things," said Miss Marple. "On whether the village can truly accept her, on whether she feels the need for reconciliation with the place of her youth. But I also think she has found something more important than return. She has found the ability to live with what she knows to be true, and that is no small achievement. They paused at the stone wall above the marl cuttings, where Clara's veil had been found folded so carefully. The view was as fine as it had been that evening in late June. The valley spread below in summer green. The village nestled among its trees. "It is strange to think," said Dolly, "that what looked like a tragedy was really a kind of liberation." "Not strange at all," said Miss Marple. "Disappearing is often easier than staying when the alternative is living a lie." But Clara did something more difficult than either disappearing or staying. She chose to reappear as herself, honest and unburdened, even though it meant exile from everything familiar. She looked out across the landscape, her expression thoughtful. "I knew a young woman once who ran away from an engagement because she could not bear to tell her fiancé about a difficulty in her past. She spent years in hiding, living under a false name, always afraid of discovery. When she was finally found, she said the hardest part had not been the running, but the continued lying. She had become someone she did not recognize, and the weight of that was worse than any scandal could have been." "What happened to her?" asked Dolly. "She told the truth," said Miss Marple simply, "and found that the world did not end. Her fiancé had married someone else by then, and her family was hurt by her deception. But she was herself again, and that mattered more than all the rest." They turned back toward the village, walking slowly in the golden light of late afternoon. The church bell struck the hour, its voice clear and familiar across the fields. "Do you think people will remember this kindly?" asked Dolly. "Or will Clara always be the bride who disappeared?" "They will remember both," said Miss Marple, "the disappearance and the reason for it. But I think in time they will remember more her courage in choosing honesty over comfort. That is the kind of thing that villages remember, even when they forget the details." As they reached the manor house, Dolly turned to her friend with a smile. "You understood from the very beginning, didn't you? What Clara had done and why?" "I suspected," said Miss Marple. The small detail suggested it, the veil folded as though being set aside with respect rather than discarded in haste. The brooch returned unworn because borrowed dignity cannot sustain an honest life. The date changed because even the smallest deception felt like too much. All of it pointed to someone who was settling accounts as truthfully as circumstances allowed. She paused at the door and looked back toward the village, where smoke rose from cottage chimneys and children played in the lengthening shadows. "In the end," she said softly, "Clara chose to live with what she could say